Cool. Welcome everyone, and thank you for having us. My name is Simon Tkachenko. I'm a principal at Modus Capital. We're a MENA-focused VC fund with an operational arm attached to us. And here with me, I have Kareem Elsirafy, who's a managing partner at Modus. Welcome, Kareem.
Thanks, Simon. Great to be here, and thanks for having us aboard.
Great. So we've picked out a few topics that we think are top of mind for many people in the industry and in the region. So we wanted to run through and give you an idea of how we think about them at Modus and kind of what we've heard other investors talk about in the region. So you ready to dive in, Kareem?
Good.
All right, let's do it. So I think the topic of everyone on top of everyone's minds so far, unfortunately, is still COVID-19. And we've seen a lot of how COVID-19 has played out in many of the public companies and larger industries, but it's often not seen exactly how it plays out in startups and entrepreneurship. So we thought that'd be a great place to start. So Kareem, can you talk a little bit about the trends you're seeing in startups and entrepreneurship and how COVID-19 has impacted those?
Sure. So I think there's some companies that have done really well, obviously, right? Some industries that have done very well. I think some of the obvious ones are like e-commerce, right? The lack of people's ability to be able to go out, physical brick and mortar retail locations has really driven, it's driven a big boom in e-commerce. There are kind of also like, I would say other industries on the periphery that support that. So in the MENA region, for example, and some other regions, you're talking about like last mile delivery, where there isn't a very solid infrastructure for logistics, or that is the method essentially of logistics. I think they've done very, very well. I also think that companies that have had some good runway, for example, I know of some companies that have fundraised very well in the end of 2019.
Yeah, and it was just a matter of really luck for them that they were able to close their rounds in early 2020, late 2019. We saw a lot of activity in the MENA region specifically around that time frame, and they were just set for the next 12 months. So knowing that there was a lot of volatility to come through 2020, they were able to stick to their roadmap, continue to build and grow in whatever stage they were, and really not have to stress out about bridge rounds and losing revenue. So sometimes it just comes down to luck.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead.
And there's even like there's some companies that were like well-funded that could have been in an industry that was just really knocked off its feet, right? Because of COVID, like tourism, for example, right? But if they were well-funded before that, they have the ability to kind of like pivot their product or create an interim product strategy, et cetera, until their like core market focus kind of comes back or rebounds. So yeah, 100%. Some other companies as well is, companies that have a big focus on digital customer acquisition. We all know that the cost of customer acquisition was significantly reduced, right, as a result of COVID. So when your normal customer acquisition cost was, let's say $20 a customer, but now it's been reduced down to like 5 to 7, those companies are able to really stretch their dollars and go a long way. There were some other companies that were obviously hurt by the pandemic, obviously like tourism, there's a couple other sectors. All right, we should probably
break.
All right, let me see. Companies that were hurt by the pandemic. All right. So there were some companies that were hurt by the pandemic, but I think the one great thing, and I love this, I love as an investor, and I know you see it too, Simon, is I love it when there's a liquidity crunch. When cash is tight, right? This forces companies to be like ruthlessly efficient with their capital, right? So they trim all the fat on the excess spending that they were doing. They start focusing, they become less exploratory and, really hyper-focused on their core product, their core customers, their core market. And they end up innovating, right? They're forced to kind of like innovate. So for me, like the companies that benefit from this the most are the companies that are able to really like pause and reset and essentially like pivot to like this new normal, right? And with the limited liquidity that's out in the market, actually be forced to progress in a way that they're able to, right? Considering the constraints that are around them.
Yeah, and if we think about the most recent liquidity crunch prior to this was, or the biggest one really back in 2008 through 2010, and some of the companies that came out of that, you have your Ubers, some of the biggest unicorns today were born during a liquidity crunch, whether it was because you have entrepreneurs out of work and they just say, all right, let's do it. Or they just become, as you mentioned, ruthlessly efficient, and they take the things they learned there and just build a company on top of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So if we can shift a little bit, we'll stay on the topic of the pandemic, but we'll talk about the acceleration that the pandemic has caused in technology and digitalization. So can you talk about kind of those trends that you've seen, and specifically what industries are you seeing that in right now?
Sure. So we talked about e-commerce, for example. I think that it's a lot of companies have realized that brick and mortar distribution may be a thing of the past. I don't think it'll be a thing of the past in perpetuity. I think that it'll have a new norm, a new balance, essentially. Will it continue? I think it may. It'll be interesting to see the amount of, consumer behavior data that comes out of this big influx of e-commerce, and see how people can really capitalize on that to make, more innovative products, more seamless experiences. I think that'll be interesting. A couple other areas, medtech, for example, new, more efficient way to be able to deliver services, somewhere where you're not going to be exposed, to potential harm. A lot of people think that going to the hospital is safe, but really going to the hospital, you're going to a centralized area of potential exposure. So same thing at like a doctor's office, but I think that this trend will stay, right? And you can see that with a big push in, any usually good regulatory change usually comes from consumer demand, right? And this is one of those scenarios where the consumer demand and the necessity is actually going to be driving the legislation and the regulation around it. And that's really the best way to create like legislation or legislation or regulation that's actually efficient and effective, right? When there's an operating model that works reactively versus doing something proactively, and then the private sector has to kind of like adapt to it. Another one obviously is like ed tech. I know that you've looked at, again, some companies that have been in the ed tech space.
Yeah, I think ed tech is going to be a really interesting play post-pandemic, just because the model is kind of proving itself, in that if you come up with an efficient way to educate using technology, people will begin to leverage that, and they could do it from anywhere, as opposed to needing to be in a physical location. I think that we'll see less weight being put on traditional education methods, whether it's getting an MBA or some type of master's, and maybe you'll just focus on classes you want, and at a much more efficient price at that. And it's really democratizing education way more than where we are today in the traditional, again, brick and mortar, whether it's e-commerce or education.
Yeah. But, there is something, I still am a firm believer though. And like, when we were all in college doing, group projects and whiteboarding things, and I still do think that there is part of the educational experience being in person. I do think there's still a very, very notable value in that. So it'll be interesting to see how, like, again, the new normal, right, of the blend between full digitalization, which is what you're seeing right now in with ed tech, and also like, when it kind of comes back, what is the balance going to be? I mean, technology and remote learning was part of, even our era, or even our previous generations to a degree, part of it at least. Don't want to make myself seem old, but it was always a part of it, right? The remote learning. But now, as it being like the primary way, again, it'll be really interesting to see how like it levels back out and balances.
Yeah, I think it'll eventually be a mix, and specifically, I think in STEMs, you'll be able to utilize technology to give developing economies access to things like virtual science labs, without needing the huge capex up front to actually build a science lab for a school. So I think as you mentioned, it'll be a balance, and we'll see how it pans out.
Yeah. Another interesting thing that I think that has had a lot more focus is advertising technology, right? This OTT products, over the top television, your Roku, your Apple TV, your Google Chrome, like all of these, the consumption now with everybody like staying at home has significantly shifted to a lot of these video on demand devices and these OTT devices. So I think, there's going to be, there's a big opportunity in leveraging that spike, right? And that may also become a new normal, or again, a higher percentage of content consumption through these platforms gives a really big opportunity for advertisers to figure out how, innovative ways for them to be able to capture the consumer during that, that content consumption experience.
And a question actually just arose in my mind that I think is interesting to address is, we've talked about startups, but how are corporates that were impacted, or their businesses were impacted by the pandemic, such as real estate companies that own malls, are they adapting to this and leveraging technology and either innovating internally or acquiring startups that facilitate their ability to, for example, become an e-commerce platform? Are you seeing that at all?
Yeah, actually, so I'm seeing it in two ways, right? One you mentioned, which is the pure acquisition play, right? Look for companies that can provide a significant value added to your core product offering, right? Whether it's an e-commerce platform for a mall, or again, some sort of like delivery company, et cetera. But aside from that is also, you're seeing these traditional like real estate, for example, as you mentioned, brick and mortar, really tough. And real estate developers have to think of innovative ways. And the other way that I see them doing this is pushing to create corporate innovation programs, right? So what, a traditional real estate developer that is really about building and then selling or leasing now is looking at ways, where they can enhance, the management of property through technology, right? Reducing some of that overhead and seeing that as an investment. And the interesting thing is where you see the corporate innovation kind of coming from is them saying, look, I've got a big company, and in this company, I've got a whole bunch of subject matter experts, from designers to operators, engineers, et cetera. And these subject matter experts are, why should I look outside for that innovation when I've already got a pool of highly talented people who understand my core business and the methodology in which we operate as a business, right? So maybe it's worth putting some money behind them in a corporate innovation program to see, hey, what problems do we have? Is there an opportunity for us to create a technical solution to solve this problem? And they can do that through corporate innovation programs. So 100%, I see a lot of like very traditional businesses, again, using this real estate example, moving forward with that new kind of mentality.
Yeah, and from a kind of HR perspective, it's a great way to empower your employees and then keep them happy and give them something different to work on, as opposed to traditional work. So great. And I know we're running a little bit out of time, but I think we want to touch a little bit. That's something near and dear to our hearts at Modus, and I know this is something that brought you into the region specifically, is work around social entrepreneurship. So how has the pandemic impacted social entrepreneurship, and how is technology helping propel that forward?
Yeah, so really good question. I think, the remote work aspect of it, right? I think allows, individuals or categories of individuals who may not have, where working from home or working remote may have been convenient for them, but it wasn't convenient for the companies, right? But now that it has become not just convenient, but necessary for the companies, you essentially open a job market to individuals that previously maybe weren't considering it, right? So when you talk about, let's say, mothers, right, at-home moms, right? At-home moms now have the ability to work remote, work from home. They don't have to find a nanny or a babysitter and clock out, and they don't have to sacrifice that. They can find that balance. I think another thing is being more open to remote work allows you to employ people in other regions that normally you wouldn't consider doing remote work. So you wouldn't consider going to a developing country to be able to create jobs, for example, and get a service from somewhere that may be cost effective for you and at the same time socially impactful. So I think that's one way. Another way, for example, in an industry is like fintech. I know that we've been working with a fintech company. And one of the things that they were doing was helping with the capturing kind of the unbanked and underserved population in specific emerging markets. I know that you've had a lot of experience with it. So if you want to touch on that.
Yeah, I think fintech's a really interesting one. We've obviously been talking about fintech for feels like close to a decade now, but with the pandemic, we've really been seeing that it's expediting the unbanked and underbanked population of joining the formal financial economy, and they bypass what is sometimes an intimidating process of going into a bank and opening a bank account. They're able to do it from their smartphones, and because smartphone penetration is so high, especially in developing countries, they're able to do it from their home. They're able to always access it. And I think it has downstream impacts where we'll see expensive remittance corridors being eliminated, because now instead of going to a Western Union, you're able to transfer money to a bank account that's on your phone. So I think it'll be exciting to see developing economies expedite the process of joining the formal economy, and that will end up helping them develop as a nation.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that's not maybe directly correlated to social entrepreneurship, but I think is I've seen as like a benefit from what's kind of happened that does touch on a social aspect is, you mentioned it earlier and it really, it kind of like rang the bell in my mind, is HR departments, right? Companies that now have a majority of their workforce working at home has forced them to really look at their HR policies and HR more than a administrative function, right? There is a humanistic element to being able to support your team, right? Your people, right? And, I've always said this, a company is nothing more than a group of people working together towards the same goal, right? And it's people really like at the center of it. And HR departments now understanding that, no, it's not just about payroll and taxes and days off and again, all the administrative stuff, but it's about touching base with people and see how they're adapting to being at home, touching base with them, making sure that this new type of work environment is it's positive and conducive to them actually being able to have good output, right? And again, it kind of brings that like humanistic element back into HR. And I think that's something that's, a lot of people have kind of been overlooking, and it's easy to kind of overlook, it's when it's a very functional type of job. But I'm glad that it's actually happening, because I think it's making employers really look at their teams a little bit differently, and taking those steps to make a better work environment, be it in the office or remote. It's bringing it's bringing out the company culture in a lot of companies and creating a stronger corporate fabric, if I may say.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, thanks, Kareem, for taking the time. It was good to chat with you. I know you and I probably talk every day, but it's good to actually record some of our calls, because I think we do dive into these just on our one-on-one. So thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone for having us, and we look forward to joining again soon.
Great.
Take care.